Okay, so hi. Those of you here who know me already probably know me from doing my work in substrate-independent mines or uploading, downloading, offloading, whatever you want to call it, all these other vague terms. What I'm going to talk about today, though, is not another introductory talk about ASIM, or Advancing Substrate-Independent Mines. Still, I want to jump back just for a moment and talk about original objectives. And why do I even do what I'm doing? Why am I interested in this thing called uploading? Why would any of us be interested in the things that we do in the first place? Well, in my case, it basically started when I was a young teenager, and I realized that the thing I liked the most was to try to learn everything and create anything. But I also really quickly realized that it was impossible for me to learn everything and create anything because I was limited both in time and in capabilities. So something has to be done about that. And one of the things you bump into very quickly is the fact that we rely on our brains, but that our brains, unfortunately, are really hard to interpret. Oh, so this microphone, I don't think it's actually...
The microphone's only for the live stream.
Yeah.
Yeah, the sound system in this room conveniently broke a couple days before the conference. So
Yay. Okay.
So the microphone is not actually connected to the room speaker system.
All right, so I'll just try to I'll just try to be louder. So what I was trying to say is that one of the things that you immediately notice if you're trying to deal with the problem of learning everything and creating anything, so you know, this thing that I have trouble with is I don't have enough time, I don't have enough capability, is that we rely on our brains, but that our brains are hard to interpret and hard to access. This is something that is really difficult to get at. Now, there's something that AGI, or what I'm calling AHI here, Artificial Human Intelligence, and we can debate that later if you want to, and substrate-independent mines have in common, is that both of these try to deal with the problems of that kind of interpretability, but also with time and capabilities. I'm also here representing an organization called Carbon Copies, which I actually started earlier in the year together with Suzanne Gildert, who's also here and is the next speaker. The thing about this organization is that it tries to advance the work towards uploading, let's just call it that, and be practical about it, because now we're at a time where even if we don't know exactly what technologies to look at, which is why the organization is what we call technology agnostic at the moment, it is now a time where we can at least imagine the kind of technologies that would be necessary. We have a real idea of what they might be. And for that, in order to achieve that ultimate goal of the accessibility, the interpretability of the mind, so uploading, we need to be able to create networks of people that work in those fields, many of them in the mainstream areas that are connected to it, but they may not know that what they're doing is related to anything that we talk about here when we're in these conferences. But at the same time, we have to explain what the fundamental principles are, what is underlying this idea of substrate-independent mines. And we basically have to put together a big puzzle. And that's what Carbon Copies is really about. It's trying to take this big puzzle of things that are already being dealt with by other people elsewhere, putting them together, and looking at what are the puzzle pieces that are missing. What are the key parts that are not getting any attention that should be getting attention and resources, and dealing with that. Now today, I'm specifically going to talk about this issue of what can we learn from the implementation that we already have on top of our shoulders. What about this 25-watt biocomputer that's running here? Because that's really what it is, right? It's a complicated machine. And it's doing a certain thing, and it's doing it fairly well. So what is it that that does, and what can we learn from it? Now, the first thing I want to make very clear, and I can't overemphasize this, is how important it is to realize that everything is in the mind. We've heard a lot of really interesting talks yesterday, all kinds of broad transhumanist ideas that are extraordinarily interesting. But no matter what things you want to do, whether you're interested in creating artificial intelligence, whether you want to commercialize quantum computers, Jordi, or anything else, really, what it boils down to is these are all things that are going on inside your mind. It's the only perspective you have. So really, we're just in this box here. There's some information we're processing. There's a world that we've created for ourselves. It all goes on in there. You can say self is illusory. Consciousness is illusory. Seeing you here is illusory. This is a perception. This is something that I'm generating inside my mind. It's emergent. Nevertheless, it's all I've got. Now, AGI, or AHI as I like to call it, is about creating kernels of intelligence, something that is based on what we know about how thinking happens, for example, in humans, and using that to create some intelligent systems. ASIM differs from that only in that we're trying to replicate specific kernels based on human minds and use those to create intelligent systems. And what we do then, of course, is add capabilities, make them work over a longer period of time, so longevity, and what you have then are many of the goals of transhumanism. So when you get interested in something like the brain, and you know that's what you want to investigate, what happens? You get an explosion of different fields, research fields that are interesting and that you need to look into. And just to give you a quick overview here, when we're thinking about thinking, what kind of fields are those? At the highest level, you've got things like psychology, psychiatry, cognitive science. Psychiatry, of course, being about the medical questions of what goes right and what goes wrong in our thinking, in our brains. Psychology being about a high-level understanding of how we think. What are the different kinds of thinking that we carry out? How does perception work? This is really useful. That's the kind of thing that we care about in our daily lives. If we're really reductionist and we think about how all the functions work on the lowest level, okay, that's great for neuroscientists. This is great for someone who wants to understand how you could, tinker with it or fix it or something like that. But the highest level is where we really want to understand about meaning, about how it all fits together. So I just want to make sure that you understand that I see some value in psychology and cognitive science, even though my background really is more in neuroscience and actually computational neuroscience. So where what we care about is exactly that, the functions, the mechanisms. What are those neural mechanisms? How does it work? And in the end, how could you build a brain emulation, for example? Many neuroscientists are working in that area, even if they don't realize it. Ben was saying, okay, here's a neuroscientist who takes seriously the implications from transhumanism, what this means for us when we look at neuroscience. I think most neuroscientists would agree, even if they maybe don't want to be associated immediately with all kinds of other aspects of what we might talk about. But if you look at what neuroscientists are talking about, they're saying things like, okay, I'm going to make a very specific, detailed model of some area of the brain. We're going to run it, and it's going to be able to do what the real brain can do in that area. Or, like Henry Markram, we're going to take a whole mini-column, we're going to emulate that thing, and eventually in 10 years we'll do the thing for the whole brain. So how is that different from uploading or whole brain emulation? It isn't really. So this just means we're looking at a machine, a complex machine, and neuroscientists are investigating that, and that's what we're aiming at. Artificial intelligence. This is kind of coming at it from another side. Again, we're interested in thinking and intelligence. We're interested in the sort of things that we know about from the human mind, but it's from a more abstract, formal perspective. How could we formulate how this thinking takes place? Think about pattern recognition, machine learning, probabilistic computing, things like that. Now I'm going to have to take a swig of that water. Okay. Sorry about that. It's the LA air. It's very dry. Okay, so the brain. What do we get from that? There are two really important things that we get from the brain. First of all, it exists. And secondly, it works, or at least it works.
You're more confident when you made the slide. On the slide only appears to exist.
Oh, yes, you're right. Yes, it appears. No, I mean, strictly speaking, if I'm, it only appears to exist because the evidence is once again just in my mind. It's this world that I'm generating here. But yeah, you're right. You're right. I'm a little more confident this morning. It exists and it works, and it works for the kinds of problems that it was evolved towards. These are really important advantages, and I cannot stress enough how important they are. Plus, I'm surprised. I'm surprised that this isn't obvious. Because, for example, earlier this year, I was talking at a general intelligence conference, the AGI conference, and I was talking about something similar. It's kind of like this talk. It was another talk about how does a certain system in the brain work. In that case, it was about reinforcement learning and how might that be implemented in the brain. And I was really surprised to see a colleague, an esteemed colleague, I won't mention names, get up at the end of the talk and basically tell me, this is really nice, but I really don't see how we learn anything from this for artificial intelligence or artificial general intelligence. What does this have to do with anything? And I don't know what to say. That's, okay, I do know what to say about that. Actually, I'll get back to that in a moment. I think I kind of understand what he was trying to say, but maybe he wouldn't like me to say that. Anyway, we'll find out. So, the brain's comments on thinking. What does the brain think about thinking? First of all, if we look at the brain specifically, then we can learn something about what is going wrong and what isn't going wrong in psychiatry, so we can learn about brain health. In psychology, it helps us to understand ourselves and why we do things the way we do them or don't. In neuroscience, we get our working example there. We look at actual brains to learn about those functions, the neural mechanisms. And then in artificial intelligence, well, there's a lot that you can do by having a system that you can compare with. You've got an actual prototype somewhere of some system that works to a certain degree, and you can compare with that. You have a measure there, as well as you can learn about specifics. Some of the specifics that we see in the brain that are now also in AI, for example, are the idea of distributed computing. That's what neural networks are really about. Or the origin of the notion of probabilistic reasoning, the concept of reinforcement learning, and of course the whole idea that you can build modular systems that have multiple different kinds of memory and different types of representations, etc. So this is the brain's comments on thinking. Now, what are Pinky's comments on thinking? Okay, well, what he says, but it's so messy. And I think this gets back to what that esteemed colleague was trying to tell me, even though he didn't know he was trying to tell me that at the conference, which was, if you want me to think that knowing about the brain is really important to understanding how to do intelligence in other systems, then I'm going to have to become a neuroscientist, and I'm going to have to understand all about this stuff. And that's just too much, so I don't want to do that. Okay, so is it really so messy, though? How diverse is this? First of all, yeah, there's no single algorithm for general intelligence in the brain. It's not the result of a single design or a single design principle. Although there is one underlying concept that is the same over time, which is, of course, that it emerged from competition for survival. But the conditions under which it did that changed. But what was it that changed about those conditions? It wasn't mostly the environment at large. It wasn't that our sun suddenly changed or something like that. It was mostly about competition with other species. So about competition between others who were also evolving and changing and maybe improving their intelligence and their tactics. Okay, so this is not a design that's optimized towards the generality of all possible conditions. In fact, what we have here is optimization within a niche. And if you're going to optimize within a niche and you want to be efficient, you want to be very competitive both in resources as well as what you can carry out with those resources, then what you can do is a shortest path optimization inside that niche towards something that works well and that also happens to have an ease of adaptability by simply adding more of the same, like let's say more cells, more layers, more things of the same nature to get an advantage. So, improving the brain is a way to get our genes to survive. A general approach would be more cautious in every environment because it can work in many more environments. And so, you know, you could then tinker along and tweak it to work now and work later and in Australia and here. But it's simply, you know, that's a very difficult resource hog. Plus, it's not necessary when you're doing evolution because really, in evolution, you only have the winners and the losers aren't around to complain. So, no problem there. Now, a few words on diversity. What kind of diversity do we see in the brain? Just to give a few examples. Let's look at some cell types in operation. There are definitely different kinds of cells in the brain. They're all neurons. Okay, not all of them. There are other things too, but neurons, let's just look at neurons. Different neurons in there, but they are doing different things. If we say, let's look at muscle control. Muscle control is a situation where the neurons really, together, they sum their activity and basically give you a vector that's telling you what your limb is supposed to do. On the other hand, if you look at the auditory system, it's extremely important for those neurons to be able to catch exactly when a spike is occurring. Spike timing, highly important in order to be able to hear. Now, representations. In some areas, you have that highly distributed representation. So, say in the cortex, where we distribute the representations of the things that we know, sometimes you can get shot through the brain with a bullet, and all you do is you lose some precision of what you know. There's a sort of vagueness there, but it doesn't wipe out the memories. It doesn't wipe out function, if you're lucky. Well, there are some things behind me here. Okay. In other regions, though, you have a sparse distribution. That's where the concept of the grandmother cell came from, for example. That there would be one cell that's representing one concept. And you see that a lot, for instance, in areas that are involved with acquiring new knowledge, like the hippocampus. It's very useful there. We'll get into that in a moment. Okay, diversity in arrangements or structure. We have the older limbic system, but then compare that with the newer neocortex, where suddenly we have a structure that is layered and has a lot of the same architecture over and over and over again in these columns. This is interesting, and also you see that in different species you have a different number of layers, for example. But even within our own brain, if you look in different regions, you'll have different numbers of layers. 5 in the entorhinal cortex, 6 in the visual system, things like that. So are we just taking something new, something that's much more refined, much more efficient, has this wonderful new structure, and adding it to an old clunker, basically like keeping MS-DOS around when you're using Windows or something like that? It's not as simple as that. Recycling in the brain involves using those same parts for new purposes with new I/O. This is, okay, I'm going to talk about the hippocampus just because that's an area that I used to work in a lot, so it's familiar to me. But there, for example, in rats, when you think about what the hippocampus is for, it's mostly involved in all sorts of spatial tasks, things like navigating around and running and stuff like that. Whereas in humans, the hippocampus has taken on a very important role in what we call declarative memory. So about all matters of acquiring declarative memory, this is the memory that we can explicitly access, and also this subset that we care very much about called episodic memory. So the ability to remember what happened now and now and now and now and kind of put it all together into an episode. So what we have here is an ancient system that's helping us do something that is very crucial for some of the things that we consider the highest forms of intelligence, or that's really important in human thinking. And this has been combined together with this big reservoir that we call the neocortex, and together it gives us an automated and unsupervised mechanism for taking care of the grounding problem. Okay, I'll take another swig of water here, so you have a moment to digest what I just said. Okay. Another word on diversity. In this case, I want to make a point about modularity and using different mechanisms for different purposes, even if they seem similar. And what I want to talk about is memory, because that's the system that I happen to study for my PhD thesis, so this stuff was all in there. When we acquire new memory, of course, the first thing is that we don't know when interesting stuff is going to happen. We don't know if it consists of any patterns that already make sense to us, if it's stuff that we've already seen or not. So we cannot rely on there being existing synapses that will fit those representations. What we need is some kind of short-term store that doesn't depend on all that. And there is, in fact, something in the brain that can do that. There are neurons throughout our brain that can switch into an intrinsic spiking mode, meaning that they will activate, if they've gotten some input that causes them to spike, they'll activate again every theta cycle, so every 125 milliseconds for a while. Also, there's recurrent inhibition, so any pattern that's active in there will suppress other activity, so you don't get a mixing of patterns. And then at another time, you could get another pattern to load up into there. So eventually, you can end up holding multiple patterns in order, reactivating every 125 milliseconds. That's an episodic buffer. This is keeping an episode of things that happened active in your mind without any reliance on synapses, just through activity for a short period of time. Long enough so that the activity in there can make use of Hebbian learning on the synapses to actually establish memories. This is what you get at the next stage. So intermediate term memory, it's chemical. We're using synapses that are already there, but we're strengthening some and weakening others, LTP and LTD. At the same time, if you're acquiring new information, you want to make some kind of meaning of it. So you need to attach some kind of a concept tag. And luckily, in the dentate gyrus, that's really easy, because the dentate gyrus is a place where we have an affluence of neurogenesis going on, even in adulthood. So we have a lot of cells that aren't connected to anything yet, and that will happily associate with new patterns. Then eventually you need to combine all this stuff that you've just learned with the old knowledge that you already know, but you don't want to wipe out your old knowledge, so you need to do what in artificial intelligence they call interleaved learning. And you can do this in the brain, and we see that you can do this in the brain because during what we call sharp waves, there's an activity that sometimes comes from areas of the brain that have knowledge in that we already hold, that sort of just reactivates older knowledge, and sometimes it's activity that's just been stored in the hippocampus right now, and we see the reactivation of the same sequence in the same order, and these occur kind of at random, and for example, during sleep. This is the main time when we have sharp wave activity, during sleep. And then eventually, doing this, you can lay down the patterns of synaptic connections that lay down your actual memories throughout your brain and do this by adapting the morphology, changing the synapses, changing the dendrites so that you have something that will stay put. Okay, word on feasibility. Making a system in the real world, in some environment, some resources are more limited than others. Sometimes it's energy. Acquiring the resources to do the kind of functions you want to carry out. That can be hard, not just in the brain, but also on something like this, battery power. So some improvements are cheaper than others. It's easy to make more cells. It's easy to make more layers. You already know how to do that. The DNA has a blueprint for how to do those things. Competing, okay. Different species are co-developing, so you need to keep competing with those species as well, and if you don't, you're eliminated. Now all these things, these rules, there are probably many more, they give us some interesting results, and one of them, I just want to point out, is lazy computation and empirical evaluation. So you have hardware, for example, that reacts quickly enough for its medium, say water, for instance, to get you to swim away from your prey before you get eaten. And for this, it uses continuous feedback. So really, it's taking the way the universe is affecting all of its parts. It's using the computation that the universe is carrying out about everything that's going on and using that as part of its solution, rather than computing everything in advance. So what you don't get a lot of is circuits that are doing precise calculations, that are predicting current flow, resistance, energy reserves, ballistic curves, etc. Basically, unless we really have to, don't carry out a virtual reality simulation of the environment you're in your head. Just use it. Kick the universe and see how it responds. So really, yes, it's all in the mind, but the brain does use its environment and its embodiment to function. Okay, now quickly. So why does our hardware manage at 25 watts? Just a whole bunch of points. First, there's this lazy offloaded computation I just talked about. Then there's what I call emergent pattern state. This is the idea that there's always a sensible state, or the brain always returns to a sensible state. If you're unconscious, you eventually return to a sensible state. You don't become crazy just because you needed, you weren't reprogrammed or something. Static hardware memory. It's like these new things coming up with memristors, but you can also come up with any other kind of implementation you want. This memory doesn't simply disappear. You've got the morphological changes, for example. It's event-triggered, clockless. Most neurons just need to sit there and watch out what's happening in their environment. Do they receive input? Okay, maybe they'll fire. If it is not clockless, like for example in that short-term memory buffer I was showing you, when that's going on, you can actually detect the power increase. Howard and Kahana did this experiment on patients who were undergoing surgery for epileptic seizures, and they did intracranial EEGs and let them think of different length lists, and they could actually see the power spectrum increase in proportion with the length of the list. So this is very clear evidence of that kind of a buffer system. Now, there's also tuning by relative phase rather than rate. It's all spike-based. Analog summation and multiplication. Nonlinear operations, which is very good if you're making decisions, and it's also very well matched to the physical environment. Nanoscale architecture, and by that I don't mean the synapses themselves, because they're rather large, actually. What I mean is the distances between the synapses. Dendritic computation. When an electrical pulse arrives at one point on a dendrite, it matters how far that is from another point on the dendrite where an electrical pulse may have arrived just previously, because that will interact. So the distance matters. We use different mechanisms that are suited to a given scale. Let's say if you want to do something broad with a slow impact and lasting effects, you can use chemical diffusion. If you need something with speed and precision, use electrical propagation. And if you need to do something that lasts, is distributed, and requires complex modifications, carry out morphological changes. You can rewire the entire system. So what the brain does, it blurs the lines of function. It's very opportunistic. Take all these other cells in the brain. Neurons are not the only cells in the brain. There are a huge number of cells in there that are called glia. There are in fact more of them than there are neurons. And for the longest time, it was understood that these were giving us a support function. They were keeping the whole system alive. They were cleaning it up, etc. But there's more to it, because now we know that there's probably also some information processing going on there, even if it is slower, more distributed, a little diffuse, but it's important. The brain uses small potential differences, and in fact, it's actually more conductance-based rather than potential-based. Slow switching speeds. It's very rare to find any neuron that can fire faster than at a rate of, say, 100 hertz. But even though they're slow, they're very precise. So there's an asynchronous precise timing that these neurons are attuned to. You have many cheap components, so the system is robust, and also it learns, so it's tunable by itself. It doesn't have to be perfectly designed ab initio. You have local computation with lots of cache near each processor. So every single neuron and synapse actually has a lot of different kinds of cache. There's short-term potentiation, long-term potentiation, morphological changes, and many, many more. And then there's also the total and sometimes redundant over-parallelization in the system. It's not as if, let's say, if we had a computer and we gave every thread of the program one processor. No, we give every thread. Why don't we give it 1,000 or 1,000,000 processors? Okay, so that's the brain. Why does the blue brain, this is this system in Lausanne that Henry Markram is working on, the one that emulates a cortical column in a rat, why does that consume kilowatts? Okay, it's pretty obvious actually, because of course the hardware is a uniform hardware platform that's designed to do very many different things. It's basically just a computer, general purpose computer, and it's trying to emulate all the stuff I just talked about every millisecond. So this is definitely not evolved towards the physical function it's trying to model. I just put down a different random example here of something that would be more evolved towards what you're trying to do. Let's say if you want to do something random, use atmospheric noise as a random generator rather than some other complicated function. Now, choices. So what does this mean? Well, I think, first of all, I should be fair and honest enough to say that it also has drawbacks to design a system the way that the brain is designed. It's difficult to interpret, as I already said, hard to access, fix, replace, modify. These things are not easy to do. It's critically dependent on life support and the system it's evolved towards, so you can't just take a brain, put it in a vacuum, or put it on Mars or something. It won't work anymore. It's not adapted well to different kinds of competitive environments. And basically, I mean, you can tell just by looking at these systems we're using right here that we've already found 1,000,000 different functions where those machines are better at doing them than we are. One of the problems that I personally have a lot of difficulty with is the one I've written down on the right there. Almost all experience is an emergent condition that we accept as valid rather than something supported by a high-fidelity trail of evidence. What I mean by that is memory is really lousy. I don't really know what happened yesterday, and I wasn't even drinking. It's just that all I remember are a few snippets, some images, some sounds. Most of what I remember is actually stuff that I've learned throughout my lifetime to expect, and therefore I model it. I just generate images. I generate things that seem plausible. And I put it all together, and that to me is yesterday. And if I'm going to make any decisions, if I'm going to make any executive decisions and judgments, I base them on this very sloppy trail of evidence. I might have some problems with that. Okay, our brain is also localized in space. I'm not thinking here and in Tokyo at the same time. That could be a problem sometimes. We're also localized in time, which I find even more disturbing, really, because I would really like to be able to take my brain state right now and the brain state I had an hour ago and compare them and do something useful with that, but I can't. Then there are the ones that we already generally talk about in psychology and stuff like that. Okay, short-term memory is limited, we know that. Long-term memory is finite and fallible. The processing rates, multitasking, very limited, and usually very highly limited to just about one task in each modality. We have bounded rationality. We usually overestimate or underestimate things badly. Limits of attention, we can really only attend to one thing at a time, or most of us can. There are limits of comprehension and sensory experience. I have absolutely no idea what things look like in the gamma ray spectrum. But niche optimization also gives us some advantages, things that artificial intelligence can still learn from. Like the way that events can occur at arbitrary times and it's very unpredictable what they are, but yet we can learn them, and we can learn to use that. And we derive meaning from coincidence. So the coincidence in the environment is something that we use eventually to ascribe some kind of causality to, or to use it as a pattern from which we can learn. because we have such high parallelism and only attend to one thing, we can usually let a lot of different possible paths be propagated along at the same time and then use a winner-take-all approach to decide what we do. This is kind of like this is sort of going back to the reinforcement learning example that I gave back at the other conference. The I/O that we're specialized towards dealing with is, of course, the I/O that we generally need to be able to deal with and can take care of. So it's things like disturbances in the visual field that tell us there might be a predator there or something that we should hunt. It's not about gamma ray bursts, which, first of all, we can't really detect, and secondly, we can't do anything about. So in terms of Darwinism, it's basically this pressure of frequent events that matter to us, that describe the mechanisms that have evolved. And then when you're evolving them, use cheap systems, use the cheaply evolved special purpose hardware, and stuff as much of it in there as you can to get something to work. You know, in evolution, generations really don't cost anything. There's no deadline that you're going towards. So, okay, so how should we do it? Is this always the way to go? What do you choose? I think you need to be careful about what you're aiming at. If you're aiming to optimize towards a niche or towards some domain, yes, of course, go ahead, use specialized co-processing hardware to do what you want to do. If you're exploring a domain, then the prototyping is usually easier with something a little more uniform, something more general. And you even see that inside our own brains. There are areas there that are much more specialized towards dealing with a very specific task and they're optimized, others that are more exploratory. In fact, the neocortex and the hippocampus are both exploratory regions where you see elements that are very regular, that can be reused in different ways, that get a temporary function assigned to them, and that are later recycled and reused for other functions. Whereas in, say, the sensory and motor areas, you have very specialized circuitry that always does the same thing. Now, outside the brain, I just put another example down there. You choose whether you want to implement something in MATLAB, because that's really easy to prototype with, but it's terribly inefficient, or C, assembly, FPGA, ASIC, etc. What's the take-home message here? I think that it's, okay, if we're trying to do intelligent systems, it's not just about things like equaling the raw computing power. It's about understanding what domain you're trying to build your system for. What is the goal that you're choosing for it? I mean, after all, we're building these because we want to achieve something. It's really based on our goals because, as I said before, it's really all in our mind. Everything we do, we're just doing because you've got something going on in your own mind you want to do. I don't even know if you guys are here. So, you know, it's all about that. And then choose the implementation that's right for what you're trying to achieve for that domain. So are you going to implement it in tissue in the CNS? Are you going to implement it in neuromorphic hardware or quantum computing or reversible computing or whatever else you want to do? Okay, now I have to admit, and this is just being honest, that if you drill down hard enough, you can get to something fairly uniform. You can find a level at which you can come up with a simple number of algorithms that describe the interactions between your elements and what you want to implement. It may be that you have to go all the way down to the interactions between atoms, but it's certainly lower than the level of neural networks. That level, that's not where we're at. There's much more modularity there, different mechanisms. And now I just want to make one quick meta comment on this, which connects directly to the next talk, in fact. So what I'm saying is really, okay, we always have to make choices about the systems we're designing. It's not easy to make a general purpose system, something that will work everywhere all the time and solve whatever arbitrary function you think it's going to solve. And in fact, Suzanne Gildert has pioneered and studied this underlying critical problem of generality and goal-directed reward in great detail in the recent past. And she's going to talk about that to some degree, don't know how much, next. So what I'm saying is don't treat this as a problem, you know, kind of like following up, finding the Philosopher's Stone or something, looking for something pure and perfect that's going to solve all your problems, give you the answer to all your questions. Something that general isn't just impractical, it may be impossible to create. All these things that are feasible in nature are suitable to a specific environment and have some goal-directed purpose. And obviously, those purposes, when they are things that we make, are purposes that we give them. So we'll continue to have to make choices when we develop our mind children, and we can't just create some unbounded generality that requires none of our introspection or further attention for its kernel. Thank you very much.